The wheelchair was empty before anyone screamed. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. The part that kept showing up in nightmares. 1 second, the little Korean boy was sitting at the edge of the dock, watching the dark water of Lake Michigan catch the reflection of 1,000 champagne glasses. The next second, the chair was rolling backward on its own, smooth and quiet, like someone had planned it that way, and the boy was already gone. The scream came after the splash, not before. The charity gala stretched across the lakefront pier like something out of a magazine. White linen tables, string lights hanging between iron posts, women in gowns that cost more than most people's rent. Politicians stood in clusters near the open bar. Celebrities smiled for cameras. A string quartet played something European and forgettable near the entrance, while servers moved between guests carrying silver trays. The event was called A Night for the Children, a fundraiser for disabled youth programs across Chicago. Every person there had paid $10,000 for a seat, smiled for the cameras, and felt very good about themselves. None of them moved when the boy fell in. If you are new here, welcome. This channel tells stories that Hollywood hasn't made yet, raw, real, and built to shake something loose inside your chest. Hit that follow button right now, because this one is going to stay with you. Nia Calder was carrying a tray of untouched crab cakes toward a table near the dock when she heard the splash. She was 24 years old, wearing a white server uniform 2 sizes too big, her natural hair pinned back under a small black cap. She had worked 3 shifts already that week, a breakfast diner on the south side in the mornings, a downtown hotel lobby in the afternoons, and tonight, this gala, because the agency said the tips would be good and her grandmother's oxygen bill was 3 months behind. She heard the splash and turned. She saw the empty wheelchair. She saw the ripples. She looked around at the crowd, the politicians, the celebrities, the armed security guards stationed every 20 feet along the dock, and not one of them moved. They stood completely still, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, eyes locked on the water, frozen like the cold air had turned them all to stone. Someone near her whispered a name, Kwon Daejin, son of Kwon Daejin. The name moved through the crowd like a current, and the current carried fear with it. Nia didn't know that name. She didn't know what it meant. She only knew that a child had just gone into 38-degree water and nobody was going in after him. She set the tray down on the nearest table. She kicked off her shoes, and she jumped. The cold hit her like a wall of concrete. Every muscle in her body locked at once, her lungs seized, her vision went white for half a second, and the current beneath the dock grabbed at her legs immediately, pulling sideways like it had a plan. The water was black. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. She went under and opened her eyes anyway. Small hands. She saw them 4 feet below her 2 pale hands, fingers spread open, sinking slow like they were reaching for something on the bottom of the lake. She kicked hard, got her arm around something solid, and felt the boy's body twist against her. He was conscious. That made it harder. Terrified children don't go limp, they fight. His arms came up around her neck and shoulders with a grip that felt like panic turned to iron, pulling both of them sideways and down. "Hold on to me!" She got out before water came in. He couldn't hear her. He was 8 years old and drowning, and his legs weren't working right, and the cold had him the same way it had her, total, merciless, everywhere at once. She felt them go under again. Above the water, the dock erupted. Guests were screaming now. Phones were out. People were recording the black girl in the server uniform fighting a current in freezing water, while security guards stood at the edge of the dock with their hands on their weapons and their feet planted exactly where they were. Then the sound changed. Pop! A suppressed shot cracked through the wind, flat and sharp, and a bullet tore a chunk from the metal railing 3 inches from where a man in a dark coat had just arrived at the far end of the dock. The man didn't flinch. He stood completely still and watched the water. Pop! Pop! 2 more shots. Wood splintered near the dock's edge. A woman screamed and ran. Security fanned out, weapons drawn, shouting into earpieces. Guests scattered in every direction. The string quartet dropped their instruments. The man at the end of the dock was still watching the water. Kwon Daejin had eyes that didn't blink when things went wrong. He was broad through the shoulders, not especially tall, wearing a charcoal coat that moved in the wind off the lake. His face was the kind of still that only comes from years of deciding things other men couldn't handle. He had just arrived. He had been told everything was safe. He had believed it. He did not believe it now. "Get them out!" he roared, and the sound of his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Security rushed the dock edge too slow. Daejin pulled off his coat, and before the nearest bodyguard could put a hand out to stop him, he was already over the railing. He hit the water hard and came up fast. He was a strong swimmer. He had grown up near water, trained through cold, and right now, none of that mattered because he couldn't see his son either. He went under. He came up. He scanned the surface. Then he saw her. The girl in the white uniform had his son against her chest, one arm locked under the boy's arms, kicking sideways against the current with everything she had. Her face was half underwater. She was losing. Daejin reached them in 4 strokes. He grabbed his son first instinct, not choice, and then he turned back and grabbed the girl's wrist and didn't let go, and all 3 of them rode the current sideways, until security threw a life ring from the dock, and they were pulled in, coughing, shaking, barely upright. The crowd had gone completely silent. Daejin climbed up first with his son wrapped against his chest, water pouring off both of them. Mincio was coughing hard, face pressed into his father's neck, fists twisted in his wet shirt. Daejin's bodyguards formed a wall around them instantly, weapons out, scanning rooftops. But Daejin was looking down at the dock. The girl from the water had made it to the edge and pulled herself up, and now she was on her hands and knees on the wooden planks, shoulders heaving, lips going blue. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for help. The first thing she did when she got enough breath was lift her head and look at the boy. "Is he okay?" she asked. Her voice was wrecked from the cold and the water. She asked it like the answer mattered more than anything happening to her own body. Daejin stared at her. In his world, that question didn't happen without something behind it. Everyone who approached him wanted something: access, money, protection, favors. The question was always underneath whatever words they used. This girl had just pulled his son out of 38-degree water while someone was shooting at the dock, and her first words were about the child. Before anyone could respond, Mincio twisted in his father's arms. He reached out, both hands, small and shaking, reaching past his father's shoulder toward the girl on the dock. The medics who had finally arrived moved toward the boy to check his vitals, and Mincio's entire body changed. He went rigid. He made a sound that nobody on that dock had ever heard from him before. High, raw, and absolute. "Don't take her away." The scream silenced the harbor. Every bodyguard froze. Every medic stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to pull back for a second. Daejin looked at his son's face and felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Something that came before anger, before strategy, before every decision he'd ever made about power and survival. It was the particular helplessness of watching your child break open. Mincio had not spoken with emotion to anyone since his mother died. Not to therapists, not to the tutors who came to the house, not even to Daejin himself. In the quiet moments when the house was dark and Daejin sat outside his son's room for an hour just listening to him breathe. But the boy was reaching for this stranger like she was the only thing keeping him connected to the world. And across the harbor, inside a black SUV with tinted windows parked at the edge of the marina, a man with silver-framed glasses lowered a pair of high-powered binoculars and let out a slow, quiet breath. Cha Gunwoo watched the scene on the dock with the careful attention of someone who never made a move without understanding exactly what it would cost the other person. He had planned tonight with precision. The cut brake lock, the shooter positioned on the 3rd rooftop, the timing down to the minute. And still, the boy had survived. Because of a server girl he had never seen before, Gunwoo tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when something unexpected has just become useful. "Find out everything about her," he said quietly. "By morning." His driver nodded once. The SUV didn't move. Gunwoo kept watching as medics wrapped the girl in a silver emergency blanket, and she sat on the dock, with Kwon Mincio's hand locked around her wrist, refusing to let go. Gunwoo smiled. Not because the plan had worked, because something better had just appeared. The feared Kwon Daejin had jumped into freezing water for a woman he didn't even know yet. And in Gunwoo's world, that meant only one thing. A new weakness had just been born. Was it an accident that the brake lock was cut before a room full of armed security guards? Or was the real target never the boy at all? Drop your answer in the comments and pay attention to who was already watching when Daejin hit the water. Chapter 2. The blood hit the dock railing before most people realized what had happened. 1 second. Daejin was standing over the security manager with that terrible, quiet calm. The next second, the man's face connected with the iron railing with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. And the crowd near the dock took 3 full steps backward without deciding to. Nobody ran. Nobody spoke. The security manager slid down the railing and stayed on the ground, one hand pressed over his nose, the other flat on the wet wood, like he was trying to remember how the ground worked. Daejin straightened up. He didn't wipe his hand. He just looked down at the man, the way someone looks at a chair they've decided to throw away. "You checked the chair," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was still and low, and somehow that was worse than if he had kept screaming. "Sir, you told me personally that the chair was inspected." Daejin tilted his head slightly. "You looked at me this evening and said the word, safe." The manager's mouth opened and closed. Daejin crouched down to eye level with him. "My son was in that water for 43 seconds, I counted." He let that number sit in the air for a moment. "You have until tomorrow morning to give me every name of every person who touched that chair in the last 72 hours. If one name is missing..." He paused. And in that pause, the entire dock seemed to stop breathing. "You already know." He stood back up. He turned around like the man on the ground had already stopped existing. Nia had watched the whole thing from inside the silver emergency blanket, Mincio still pressed against her side, his small fist twisted in the edge of the blanket, like he was anchoring himself to her. She had seen violence before, grown up around it, lost someone to it, but there was something about the way this man moved that was different from anything she'd ever witnessed. It wasn't rage. Rage, she understood. Rage was loud and sloppy and made mistakes. What Daejin had was something else, a cold, surgical precision that frightened her more than the gunshots had. He chose exactly how much force to use and stopped at exactly the right moment. And the stopping was the scariest part, because it meant he was always in control. She pulled the blanket tighter. Around them, the gala had collapsed into controlled chaos. Police had arrived and were setting up a perimeter at the pier entrance. 3 detectives were moving through the remaining guests, taking statements. 2 snipers had been confirmed on rooftops across the harbor. Both positions were abandoned before security reached them. The shooter, or shooters, were already gone. The event coordinator kept trying to get Daejin's attention. He kept not responding. Wealthy guests who had refused to jump into the water 20 minutes ago now stood in clusters whispering about the girl in the blanket. Nia could hear fragments without trying the way people talk when they think you can't hear them. "A server. She works the gala circuit, I think. The agency sends them. She touched Kwon Daejin's son. Does she even understand what she's involved in?" Nia understood more than they gave her credit for. She watched the way every person on that dock adjusted their body language when Daejin walked near them. Not the respectful adjustment people make around important men, the involuntary animal thing that happens when something dangerous enters the space. Shoulders pulling in, eyes dropping, weight shifting backward. The armed guards were afraid of him. Not careful, afraid. A detective approached her with a notepad and asked for her name and contact information. She gave it. She answered the standard questions: what she saw, when she saw it, how she ended up in the water. The detective wrote everything down and then asked, very carefully, whether she had any prior relationship with the Kwon family. "I've never heard of them before tonight," she said honestly. The detective looked at her for a moment too long, then nodded and moved on. She was preparing to stand up to find her shoes, get her bag from the staff room, and get herself to the bus stop before the last southbound line stopped running when she heard footsteps on the dock that were different from every other set of footsteps she'd been tracking by sound for the past hour. Deliberate, unhurried, completely certain. She looked up. Daejin was standing 4 feet away from her. He was still soaked. His dress shirt clung to him, and his hair was flat against his forehead from the lake, but none of that seemed to inconvenience him. He looked at her the way he had looked at the security manager, steady, measuring, missing nothing. Except there was something else in it now that hadn't been there during the violence. Something that didn't have a clean name. His son was beside him, wrapped in a coat that was 3 sizes too large, probably pulled off a bodyguard. Mincio looked at Nia the moment she came into his line of sight, and the tight set of his small shoulders relaxed slightly, like a breath he'd been holding had finally found its way out. Daejin spoke first. "Why did you save him?" Nia blinked. "What kind of question is that?" "A direct one. He was drowning. You didn't know who he was. He was 8 years old and underwater," she said. "I don't need to know who someone is to know they need help." Daejin was quiet for a moment. The wind off the lake moved between them, and neither of them filled the space with anything unnecessary. "That jump could have killed you," he said finally. Nia looked at him straight. "Then maybe the world would have lost 2 people instead of 1. Something shifted in his face. It was small, almost nothing, but she caught it because she had been watching people all her life, and she knew what it looked like when a word landed somewhere unexpected inside someone. He looked for just a second, like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to be spoken to like a human being. He recovered quickly. "My men will drive you home," he said. "It's not a request, it's a security measure. You were seen with my son. That puts you in a category tonight." Nia wanted to argue. She looked at Mincio, who was still watching her with those careful, exhausted eyes, and she thought about the bus ride home and the dark walk from the stop to her building, and she decided that arguing about it wasn't the hill she needed to die on tonight. "Fine," she said. Daejin nodded once. He said something in Korean to the nearest bodyguard without looking away from her, and the man moved immediately. Minseo reached out and touched her hand before they separated, just for a second, barely a brush of cold fingers, and then let his father guide him toward the waiting vehicles. Nia wrapped the blanket tighter and followed the bodyguard toward the parking area. The drive was quiet. The bodyguard didn't speak. She watched Chicago move past the window, the bright blocks near the lake giving way to darker streets, the gaps between streetlights getting longer. She was almost calm by the time the car stopped in front of her building. She stepped out, looked up at her door, and stopped completely. A man was sitting on the front steps of her building. She had never seen him before in her life. He wore a plain jacket and clean shoes, and he was looking at his phone like he was just waiting for someone. Like he had been there a while. Like he knew exactly when she was coming home. He looked up at her, smiled, said nothing. The black car behind her was already pulling away. Nia stood on the sidewalk in a wet server uniform with a silver emergency blanket still around her shoulders, and for the first time since she'd hit the water, she felt genuinely cold. Who sent him Daejin's people checking on her, or someone else entirely? Because that smile didn't feel like protection. Comment what you think is happening, and keep watching, because the answer will surprise you. Chapter 3. The man on the steps was gone by the time Nia made it inside. She turned around once at the door. He was just gone, like he'd stood up and walked off while she was still processing the sight of him. And that was somehow worse than if he'd stayed. She locked both deadbolts, checked the window latch in the kitchen, and stood in the middle of her apartment for 30 seconds, just listening to the building breathe. Then she went to check on her grandmother. Nia Calder was asleep in the back bedroom, the oxygen machine humming its steady rhythm beside the bed, the TV on low with the sound muted the way she liked it. Nia stood in the doorway and watched the rise and fall of her grandmother's chest until her own breathing matched it, and then she went and sat on the edge of the kitchen table and let herself shake for about 4 minutes. 4 minutes was all she allowed. Then she got up, peeled off the wet uniform, stood under hot water until she could feel her fingers again, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't drink and a stack of hospital bills she'd already memorized. Loretta's oxygen equipment cost $1,100 a month. The hospital debt from her admission 3 months ago was $42,000. Nia's 3 jobs covered rent, groceries, the oxygen, and the minimum payment on the smaller bills. The big number just sat there, growing, steady and patient, the way debt always does when it knows you can't outrun it. She stared at the stack of paper until the numbers blurred. Then she went to sleep. 14 blocks south of Nia's apartment, inside a hotel suite on the 42nd floor with a view of the lake, Kwon Daejin sat in a chair by the window, fully dressed at 2 a.m, and read a file on Nia Calder that his head of intelligence had assembled in less than 3 hours. It was thinner than he expected. No criminal record, no debt owed to anyone dangerous, no social media accounts beyond a basic profile she hadn't updated in 2 years. 3 employers, a diner, a hotel, and a staffing agency that placed her in events like tonight's gala. The agency listed her as one of their most reliable workers. Never late, never complained, never made trouble. No known associates connected to any of the organizations on Daejin's radar. He turned to the financial summary. The hospital debt figure made him stop for a moment. He had spent more than that on a single dinner last month without pausing to consider it, and this woman was carrying it on 3 minimum wage schedules. He flipped back to the beginning of the file. There was a note his intelligence head had flagged. Her younger brother, Nia Calder, had been killed 6 years ago. Gang crossfire outside their apartment building in South Chicago. He was 12 years old. Nia was 18. She had been the one to call the police. She had been the one to identify the body. Daejin read that sentence again. He set the file down and looked out at the lake. 3 floors down the hall, in the smaller suite with the reinforced door and the 2 guards posted outside it, Min Seo was awake. Daejin knew because the guard had texted him twice. The boy wasn't crying. He wasn't asking for anything. He was sitting up in bed and asking, in a very quiet and very steady voice, for the lake girl. Not by name. He didn't know her name yet. Just the lake girl. The therapist Daejin had hired 8 months ago had used the phrase emotional shutdown in her last report. She said Min Seo had built a wall between himself and anyone who tried to reach him, and that the wall was likely connected to losing his mother, and that patience was required. The therapist was very qualified. She had expensive credentials and a calm voice and a gentle approach. Min Seo had spoken 17 words to her across 12 sessions. He had asked for the lake girl 3 times in 2 hours. Daejin closed the file. He was not a man who believed in coincidence, and he was not a man who ignored information when it presented itself clearly. This girl had done something in 43 seconds of freezing water that a trained therapist with 8 months hadn't managed to do. He didn't understand it yet. He intended to. What Daejin didn't know, what none of his intelligence reports could have told him, was what went through Nia's head the moment she saw Min Seo's hands sinking in the dark water. She didn't think, she didn't weigh the risk. She just saw Malik. Not in any way she could explain to someone else. Not literally. But the shape of it, the small hands, the stillness, the particular way helplessness looks when it belongs to a child hit her somewhere below thought, below decision-making, somewhere ancient and unargued inside her chest. She had not been there when Malik was shot. She had been upstairs, on the phone, laughing at something one of her friends had said. She heard the shots. She thought they were fireworks at first, the way you always do. By the time she got downstairs, people were already gathered on the sidewalk. She had been too late for Malik. She was not going to be too late again. That was the whole of it. That was the complete explanation. The one she had never said out loud to anyone, and the one that lived in her body like a second skeleton. She didn't know the name Kwon Daejin. She didn't know what a man like that could do to her life, for better or worse. She only knew that a child had needed someone to move, and she had moved, and she would do it again tomorrow without changing a single thing. She noticed the cars on her 3rd day back at the diner. Not 1 car, 2. Black, expensive, parked at different points along the block, engines off, windows tinted. She noticed them because she was the kind of person who noticed things, who tracked the space around her out of long habit. The same way you learn to read a room when you've grown up in rooms that could change fast. They were still there when she finished her shift. They were there when she walked to the bus stop. She stood at the corner and looked directly at the nearer one for a long moment. The window didn't roll down. Nobody got out. She got on the bus. She thought about the man on her steps the night of the gala. She thought about the way Daejin had said it wasn't a request when he offered the ride home, like protection and control lived in the same sentence and he saw no difference between them. She thought about Minseo's voice. Don't take her away. She pressed her forehead against the cold bus window and watched the city go past and tried to figure out when her life had become the kind of life where black cars followed her to work. She didn't have an answer yet. But when she got home and found a cream envelope on her kitchen table, no stamp, no return address, slid under the door while she was out, she understood that the question was about to be answered for her. She opened it. One card inside. Thick paper, no logo, no letterhead. A phone number printed in the center. And beneath it, 4 words in clean block type. Minseo is asking for you. Nia set the card on the table next to the stack of hospital bills. She stood there for a long time. Were those black cars outside her job Daejin's protection or Gunwoo's surveillance? Because there is a very important difference, and Nia is about to walk into something she cannot walk back out of. Keep watching. Chapter 4. The mansion didn't look like a place where someone could be happy. Nia stood inside the entrance hall and understood that immediately. The ceilings were high, and the floors were pale stone, and the light coming through the tall windows was clean and cold. And all of it together felt less like a home and more like a place designed to communicate a message about the person who owned it. Every surface was perfect. Nothing was out of place. There were no shoes by the door, no cups left on tables, no signs of the comfortable disorder that meant people actually lived somewhere. There were 6 men visible from where she stood. All of them were armed. None of them had looked directly at her since the bodyguard walked her through the front door. She gripped the strap of her bag. She had called the number on the card. A man answered, not Daejin. A calm, professional voice that confirmed a car would come for her the next morning and explained what the arrangement would be. Minseo required a companion, someone he trusted, which was not a category that currently contained many people. The position would be compensated fairly, which turned out to mean a weekly rate that covered 2 months of Loretta's oxygen bill in one shot. Nia had said yes before the man finished the sentence. She told herself it was purely financial. She almost believed it. A housekeeper appeared from a corridor to the left and walked her through the first floor in silence. The kitchen was enormous and spotless. The living areas looked like they belonged in a design magazine. There was a therapy room near the back wing, with equipment she recognized from the children's hospital, where she used to volunteer parallel bars, balance boards, a ceiling lift system for mobility transfers. Nobody was using any of it. She was brought to a sitting room and told to wait. She waited for 4 minutes, exactly. Then the door opened and Minseo came in. He was in his wheelchair, moving it himself with practiced efficiency, and he stopped just inside the doorway. He was wearing a dark blue sweater, and his hair was combed carefully, and he looked, in every visible way, like a child who was managing. Like a child who had learned very young that managing was what was expected. He looked at Nia. Something happened in his face that wasn't managing. It was small and fast and real, a loosening around the eyes. The way a fist opens when it finally decides to stop holding something. You came, he said. I came, she said. He rolled the chair forward 2 feet, then stopped. I didn't think you would. Why not? He considered the question with the gravity of an adult. Because nobody stays. That sentence cost Nia something she didn't have a name for. She kept her face steady. Well, she said, I'm here today, so let's start with today. He looked at her for another moment, deciding something. Then he nodded once, with that same gravity, like they had just agreed on terms. She spent the first 3 days learning the architecture of his world. Minseo was sharper than most adults gave him credit for, which was a mistake she could see had been made many times before by the way he absorbed information with one part of his face while keeping the other part deliberately neutral. He was 8, but he read at 11. He could identify every country on a world map by shape alone. He knew the names of every bone in the human hand because he'd been curious about why his didn't always do what he wanted. His legs had partial function enough to stand with support, not enough to walk unaided. He'd been in the wheelchair since he was 3, following a complication from surgery that was supposed to help, and didn't quite. The physical therapists came twice a week. He cooperated with them completely, and felt nothing about it either way, which the therapists found difficult to work with. He felt things about Nia. On the second afternoon, he asked her to read to him. She read 3 chapters of a book about a boy who builds a radio to talk to his dead father. Minseo sat completely still the entire time, which she learned meant he was completely absorbed. At the end of the 3rd chapter, without looking up from the wheel of his chair, which he was spinning slowly with one finger, he said, "My mother died too." Nia lowered the book. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Everyone says that." He looked up. "But you sound like you mean it." "That's because I do." He studied her face with that careful adult gaze. "Did you lose someone?" "A beat." "Yes." "Did it stop hurting?" Nia thought about Malik. About the specific weight of his name in her chest. The way it had changed shape over 6 years from a sharp thing to a permanent thing. "Not all the way," she said honestly. "But it changes. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that's carrying you." Minseo thought about that for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. "Just okay." But the way he said it like it was useful information he was filing away for later made her feel like she'd given him something real. She didn't know Daejin was watching until the 4th day. She had brought a set of cards to the therapy room, simple matching games she'd found in a drawer, and she and Minseo were on the floor together, which required some maneuvering, but which he'd insisted on because, in his words, the floor was more interesting than the table. She was losing badly. And she was not losing on purpose, which he seemed to appreciate. She was reaching across to flip a card when she caught movement in the glass panel of the door. Daejin was standing in the corridor. He wasn't checking on them the way a staff member would, a quick look, professional and passing. He was standing still, watching, with his arms at his sides and his expression doing something she couldn't fully read from across the room. It was in the neighborhood of a man who has just seen something he wasn't expecting to see and is deciding what to do with that. She held eye contact through the glass for 1 second. He didn't move. Then Minseo slapped a matching pair down on the floor with great satisfaction, and Nia looked back at the game, and when she glanced at the door again, the corridor was empty. But the weight of that look stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon, something she kept turning over without meaning to. The way you keep finding a word on the tip of your tongue. There had been warmth in it, not the kind of warmth that made things simpler, the kind that made them more complicated. That evening, walking through the west corridor toward the exit, she made a wrong turn. It wasn't a dramatic wrong turn, just a door she thought connected to the entrance hall that didn't. She pushed it open and stepped through before she registered what she was seeing. The room beyond was large and mostly dark. 3 men were seated in chairs along one wall with their hands zip-tied behind them. A 4th man stood in the center of the room speaking in rapid Korean, voice flat and precise. 2 guards flanked the door she'd just come through. One of the seated men looked up at her. His face was not okay. Nia took 1 step back and pulled the door shut. She stood in the corridor with her hand still on the door handle and her heart going fast and clean and loud in her ears, and she thought, this is who you're working for. This is the full picture. Not just the father on the dock who jumped into a freezing lake. Not just the man who watched his son laugh for the first time in years through a glass panel with an expression that wasn't built for public viewing. All of it. The door opened from the inside. Daejin stepped into the corridor. He looked at her face and didn't apologize or explain. "Wrong door," he said. "Clearly," she said. "The exit is left. Then right at the end of the hall. I know where the exit is now." He studied her the same way Minseo did, like he was looking for what was underneath the surface, except Daejin's version was less curious and more like a calculation. "You didn't run," he said. "I considered it. But you didn't. I work here," she said simply, "and that's not my business." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past what was strictly necessary for a conversation about wrong doors and exit routes. Then he stepped back and held the corridor open. "Left," he said. "Then right." She walked past him. His presence was like a change in air pressure, something physical and specific, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of it for the 2 seconds it took her to pass. She didn't look back. She walked left, then right, and found the exit exactly where he said it would be. She was almost to the front gate when her phone buzzed. "Unknown number," she answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a man's voice, smooth, cultured, shaped like someone who had practiced sounding reasonable. "Miss Calder, I wanted to congratulate you personally on your bravery the other night. Truly remarkable. I do hope, for your sake and your grandmother's, that you understand the nature of the household you've chosen to enter." The line went dead. Nia stood at the gate with the phone in her hand and the night air cold against her face. She knew that voice was not Daejin's. She knew it was not a compliment. And she knew in the particular way that the body knows things before the mind has finished processing them, that whoever had just called her already knew about Loretta. Who gave Gunwoo her personal phone number? And what exactly does he plan to do with the fact that Nia now has access to Daejin's home? Think carefully about what you just watched, because the next chapter changes everything. Chapter 5. The article went up at 6 in the morning, and by 9 it was everywhere. The headline read, "Korean mogul's mysterious new companion, who is the woman living in Kwon Daejin's mansion?" Beneath it was a photo taken through the mansion's front gate, grainy, telephoto, but clear enough. Nia, walking in. The timestamp showed yesterday afternoon. By 10 o'clock, 3 more outlets had picked it up. By noon, the framing had shifted. The word companion had been replaced by words that meant something different. And the comment sections had become exactly what comment sections become when a black woman is photographed near a wealthy and powerful man. Nia read 2 paragraphs before she put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and didn't pick it up again. She already knew who had planted the story. She couldn't prove it, but the phone call the night before, that smooth, reasonable voice that knew her grandmother's situation, had its fingerprints all over this. Someone had given those photos to the press. Someone who wanted Nia visible in a specific way, in a specific context, attached to a specific man. The question was what for? She dressed and went to the mansion. The guards at the front gate looked at her differently than they had the day before. Not hostile, more careful, like they were aware of something she'd just become. She went straight to Minseo's room. He was at his desk, working on something with graph paper and a ruler, deeply focused. He looked up when she came in, registered her face, and said immediately, "You saw it." "You saw it too?" she asked. "One of the kitchen staff was talking. I heard them." He set the ruler down with precision. "They said bad things about you." "People say things," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "It doesn't make them true. It's still not fair." He said it with a directness that had no performance in it. Just the clear-eyed assessment of a child who had been on the wrong side of unfair long enough to recognize it on contact. Nia looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not. Are you going to leave?" She held his gaze. "Not today." He nodded and picked up his ruler. She heard the raised voices from 2 hallways away. A group of women had arrived for what was apparently a standing social engagement, the wives and partners of men connected to Daejin's legitimate business operations. They met in the East sitting room every other Thursday, part of the surface world that existed alongside the other one, the one with the zip-tied men and the rooms she wasn't supposed to walk into. Nia was walking past with a book for Minseo when she heard her name. She stopped. The voices were carrying more than they knew. 3 women, based on the distinct registers, and the one speaking at full volume was working through her opinion without much concern for who might be in the corridor, brought her into the house, which is already insane. Someone said she's working as Minseo's companion, which, that child needs professionals, not some girl who... The voice dropped slightly on the next part, but the walls in that corridor were not as thick as they looked. Nia stood very still and let it go past her like weather. Then she heard Minseo's voice, which meant he had come to find her, or been coming back from somewhere sharp and sudden and completely unlike his usual measured tone. "Stop talking about her." The voices in the sitting room cut off. Nia turned around. Minseo was in the corridor behind her, maybe 10 feet back, and his face had the quality of a storm before the wind picks up everything pulled inward and tight. The stillness that comes just before something breaks. "Mincio," she started. "They don't know you," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He pressed his hands flat against the wheels of his chair and the knuckles went white. They don't. He stopped. His chest was working hard. He was 8 years old and he was fighting something too large for the size of him. And Nia crossed the corridor in 6 steps and crouched down in front of his chair. "Hey," she said. "Look at me." He looked. "What they said doesn't change anything between us. Not one word of it. But it's not right." His eyes were bright and furious and wet at the edges. "You saved me and they're saying..." "I know." She kept her voice steady because his needed something steady to push against. "And it's not right." "You're correct. But right now, in this hallway, what matters is you and me, okay?" He breathed. She waited. "Okay," he said. Smaller this time. The storm coming down. "Okay." She straightened up. "Now come on. I have a book that's going to make you forget everything except whether the main character makes it off the island." He almost smiled. Almost. They were 10 feet from his room when the east sitting room door opened, and one of the women stepped into the corridor, the one with the carrying voice, in a cream blazer, looking faintly annoyed in the way of a person who has been made to feel embarrassed by their own volume and blames the listener for it. She looked at Nia. Her expression arranged itself into something shaped like a smile. "You must be the girl," she said. "Nia," Nia said. "Of course." The woman's eyes moved to Mincio, then back. "I do hope you understand that a child like Mincio requires a certain kind of care, professional care. I'd hate for attachments to form that complicate his development." Nia looked at her without any particular expression for a moment. Then she said, "Mincio's room is that way. Excuse us." She did not wait for a response. She heard the woman make a sound of pure offense behind her and kept walking. What nobody in that corridor saw was Kwon Daejin standing at the far end of the hall. He had heard everything. He had been there from the moment the women's voices in the sitting room began carrying, and he had moved toward the corridor and stopped when he realized Mincio had already found Nia, and he had watched his son's face during that exchange and felt something compress inside his chest that had no clean outlet. He waited until they'd gone into Mincio's room. Then he walked into the east sitting room and closed the door behind him. He did not stay long. When the women left the mansion 40 minutes later, the one in the cream blazer had mascara on her cheeks and was not making eye contact with anyone. 2 of her companions had not said a single word in the last 20 minutes of the visit. All 3 of their cars left the gate faster than they'd arrived. Daejin came to Mincio's room doorway at 5 o'clock. Nia was on the floor again. She kept ending up on the floor, which was where Mincio seemed to prefer his real conversations to happen reading aloud. The Island Book. The boy in the story had just built his first signal fire. Mincio was leaning slightly forward in his chair, elbows on knees, completely gone into it. Daejin stood in the doorway and did not make a sound. He watched Nia read. He watched the way she changed her voice slightly for different characters, without making it a performance. He watched Mincio's face more open than he'd seen it in 3 years, animated in the small ways that children are when they're genuinely present and not managing themselves for the room. He was quiet long enough that Nia eventually felt it and looked up. They looked at each other across the room, with Mincio between them, still absorbed in the story, and the moment lasted 4 seconds, exactly long enough to mean something, short enough to deny it. Daejin nodded once. She held his gaze for another beat, then looked back at the page and kept reading. He walked away from the door. He went to his office and stood at the window looking at the grounds and thought about a man who had planted a story in the press on purpose and a grandmother on oxygen and a phone call that should never have been made. He picked up his own phone. "Find out how Gunwoo got her personal number," he said, "and find out who inside this house helped him do it." He ended the call. He looked out the window at the darkening grounds. Across the city, in a different kind of room entirely, Nia's grandmother, Nia Calder, lay in her hospital bed. A nurse came in at 6 o'clock to check vitals. By 6:15, Loretta was alone. By 6:30, the chair beside her bed, the one that was always empty, had someone in it. The man sat very still and looked at the old woman sleeping and said nothing at all. He was just there, waiting. The story planted in the press, the phone call, the man in Loretta's hospital room, Gunwoo, is not making moves. He is setting a board. And Daejin doesn't know yet that the most dangerous piece was just put in place tonight. Don't miss the next chapter. Chapter 6. Loretta Calder's hospital room was on the 4th floor, East Wing, room 412. Nia knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, automatic, constant, the kind of knowledge that lives below thought. So when the nurse called at 7:41 in the morning and said that Loretta was not in her room, not in the corridor, not in any common area on the floor, and had not been discharged, Nia's body understood before her mind did. She was already moving before the nurse finished the sentence. She left Minseo's book on the kitchen counter, left her tea running hot, left the door unlocked, which she never did. She was down the stairs and on the sidewalk in under 2 minutes. Phone pressed to her ear, calling the hospital back and getting transferred twice, and then put on hold, which was when she stopped walking and stood completely still on the sidewalk, because if she kept moving without information, she would just be running in circles, and that was not useful, and she needed to be useful right now. She thought about the man in the cream blazer's voice. She thought about the phone call. She thought about Gunwoo saying the word grandmother without her ever mentioning Loretta at all. She called Daejin. She had his direct number because he'd sent it through the same bodyguard who drove her home the first night, in a text that said simply for Minseo's scheduling, and she had saved it without thinking much about it and never used it. He picked up on the second ring. "My grandmother is missing from the hospital," she said. No preamble, no softening of it. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "Which hospital?" She told him. "Don't go there yet," he said. "Wait for my call. She's 71 years old and she's on oxygen. Nia." The use of her name, direct and certain, cut through the noise in her head. "I will find her. Give me 20 minutes." She pressed her back against the building behind her and looked up at the sky and counted her own breaths. 19 minutes later, her phone rang. "She's alive," Daejin said. "She's not at the hospital." The pause before the next sentence was short, but she felt its entire weight. Gunwoo has her. The next 6 hours were the longest of Nia's life, and she had lived through some long ones. Daejin's men moved fast. She could see it in the way the house shifted when she arrived. The specific, controlled urgency of people who had been trained for crises and were now inside one. Cars left in pairs. Phones ran hot. Daejin was in his main office with 3 people she'd never seen before, all of them speaking in clipped, overlapping Korean over a table covered in printed maps and photos. She stood in the hallway outside the office. A bodyguard she recognized, the one who usually drove her, came out and looked at her with something closer to human acknowledgement than she usually got from the security staff. His name was Jung. He was the one who had found Loretta's name in a gas station surveillance file at 6 that morning, 2 hours before the hospital called, which meant Gunwoo had moved her in the night. "Is she hurt?" Nia asked him directly. "No signs of that," Jung said. "She's being held at a property in Bridgeport. We have eyes on the location." "Then go get her. Mr. Kwon is deciding the approach. She needs her oxygen equipment." Nia's voice stayed flat, because flat was the only thing she could manage right now. She has been without it since sometime last night. That is not a situation where anyone gets to take their time deciding the approach. Jung looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and went back into the office. 30 seconds later, the meeting inside shifted tone. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the pace. And the pace changed. Minseo found her in the small sitting room off the east corridor. She was sitting with her hands in her lap doing absolutely nothing, which was the only thing she could do. And he came in without knocking and positioned his chair 2 feet from her and looked at her face with that precise, surgical attention of his. "Something happened to someone you love," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "My grandmother." He was quiet for a moment. "Is she going to be okay?" "Your father is handling it." Something crossed Minseo's face at that, a layered thing, complicated by the specific history of what his father handling things looked like, and what it cost, and what came after. He was 8, but he was not unaware. "He's good at finding people," the boy said carefully. I know. He found my mother when he stopped. Reconsidered. He finds people, he finished. Something in how he cut the sentence told Nia there was a full version of it he had decided against, and she filed it quietly for later. She reached over and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held on. They sat like that for 40 minutes, just sitting, just holding on until the office door opened down the hall and Daejin walked out with his coat already on. He came to the doorway of the sitting room. His eyes went to their joined hands, and his expression did something private and unmapped before it settled back into operational calm. She's being extracted now, he said, looking at Nia. She's conscious and she's stable. My medic is already at the location. I'll bring her back myself. Nia stood up. I'm coming. No. She's my grandmother, and she doesn't know your people. She'll be scared. She will be less scared than you will be if you see what happens at that location in the next hour, he said. And something in his voice, not a threat, not a warning, just pure factual weight, made the argument dissolve before she finished forming it. He held her gaze for a moment. Stay with Mincio. I will bring her back to you. That is a promise. She looked at him. She thought about every reason not to trust those words. Then she thought about a man who had jumped into a freezing lake without a second thought, and she thought about 19 minutes. And she thought about the way Jung had gone back into that office after she said oxygen. Okay, she said. He nodded once and was gone. Mincio looked up at her from his chair. He keeps his promises, the boy said quietly. He kept every one he ever made to my mother. And then, so softly she almost missed it, except the last one. Nia looked down at him. But before she could ask what that meant, a phone across the hall began to ring with a specific tone that made every guard in the corridor move at once. On screen, a video call. Gunwoo's face appeared on the monitor mounted near the office door, unhurried and composed, like a man checking in on a business matter. Daejin has already left, he said pleasantly, addressing the room as if he could see everyone in it, which means he isn't watching his house. Interesting decision, he tilted his head. Tell him to choose carefully which family member gets his full attention tonight. The grandmother is only one piece. The call ended. Minceo's hand tightened around Nia's wrist. Both of them stood completely still, thinking the same thing, neither willing to say it out loud yet. If Loretta was one piece, what was the other? Gunwoo's message to Daejin has two parts, and only one of them involves Loretta. Who is the second target, and how close are they right now? Share your thoughts below and keep watching, because the next chapter reveals a secret that changes everything you think you know about this story. Chapter 7. The file was in a drawer that wasn't supposed to be unlocked. Nia found it by accident, the same way she'd found the wrong room 2 weeks earlier. The same way she kept stumbling into the corners of this house that the house didn't intend for her to see. She was looking for a charger in the small study off the main corridor, the one with the bookshelves and the reading lamp that Mincio used for his tutoring sessions. And the bottom drawer of the desk was open an inch. She wouldn't have touched it except that the corner of a photograph was sticking out. A woman, Korean, late 30s, laughing at something off camera. She was beautiful the way that real people are, not composed, not arranged, just genuinely caught mid-joy. And there was something about the angle of her eyes, the particular shape of the expression, that made Nia think of Mincio before she consciously made the connection. She slid the photo back, but the drawer was open and the folder beneath the photo was thick, and she could see at the top of the first page a name in bold type, Kwon Daejin, case summary internal. She closed the drawer. She stood up. She went back to Mincio's room and sat down and read 3 pages of the island book without processing a single word. Loretta came back to the mansion at 9 that evening, in Daejin's car, with his medic riding beside her and her oxygen running, and a blanket on her lap, and the specific expression of a 71-year-old woman who has been through something alarming and is processing it through absolute composure. Because she was raised in a time when you did not give circumstances the satisfaction of watching you fall apart. Nia met her at the door and held her for a long time without saying anything. Loretta patted her granddaughter's back in a slow, steady rhythm. I'm all right, baby, she said. I'm all right. I know, Nia said. I know you are. Over Loretta's shoulder, she saw Daejin standing by the car. He had blood on the cuff of his left sleeve. Not a lot, a narrow stripe, already drying dark. He was looking at the two of them with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that didn't have a name and didn't go away quickly. He had gone there himself. He could have sent 12 men and stayed here. He had gone himself. She held her grandmother tighter and made herself look away. She found him at 11 o'clock. He was in the East Garden, an outdoor area behind the mansion she hadn't known existed until Minseo showed her the door 3 days ago. It was plain compared to the rest of the property. Just a stone path between low hedges and a wooden bench near the far wall, and Daejin was sitting on the bench with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and his forearms on his knees, looking at the ground. He heard her coming and didn't move. She sat down on the bench, not close, not far, left a specific distance between them that acknowledged they were both aware of what sitting beside each other in the dark meant and were choosing a measured version of it. "Thank you," she said. "I told you I would bring her back. People say things." She looked at the hedges. "You actually did it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The blood on my sleeve. I noticed. None of it was hers." "I know." She turned her head slightly toward him. "I wasn't worried about that." He looked at her, a direct, uncalculated look, the kind that his public face didn't do. "You weren't." "No," she held it. "I was worried about whether she was cold, whether they'd given her water, whether her O2 levels had dropped enough to cause any lasting damage." A pause. "The blood was yours to carry. That part wasn't mine to judge." The silence between them changed texture. It became the kind of silence that has weight to it, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full. The bench was dark wood. The lights in the garden were low. Somewhere in the mansion behind them, Loretta was sleeping in a guest room with a proper oxygen setup and 2 guards outside the door. "She's a strong woman," Daejin said. "Stubborn is the word she prefers." He almost smiled. It was less than a smile, a faint, reluctant shift at the corner of his mouth, but she caught it because she was looking for it, and because when this man let something human surface on his face, it was worth catching. "Minseo likes her already," he said. Minseo walked in and asked her if she wanted to hear about the island book. She said yes. They talked for 40 minutes. Nia shook her head. "He's never initiated a conversation with someone he's just met." "No," Daejin said quietly. "He hasn't." She felt the weight of what he wasn't saying, the months and months of closed doors and minimal words, and the particular grief of watching your child seal himself away and not knowing how to reach through. She said it directly, because that was the only way she knew how to say things. The folder in the study, the one about Sua. His posture changed. Not dramatically, just a slight shift, a tightening along the jaw. "You saw it. By accident. I didn't read it." She paused. "But Minseo said something to me today, before Gunwoo called. He said you kept every promise you made to her, except the last one." The garden was very quiet. Daejin looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he said, "She didn't die from illness." Nia waited. The official story, the one that went to the press, the one her family received, was a cardiac event. She had a heart condition. It was real. But it wasn't what killed her. He stopped, restarted. She was poisoned. The poison triggered the cardiac event. It was designed to look natural, and it did, for 1.5 years. His voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held that way through enormous effort for a very long time. "I found out 14 months after she was buried." Nia absorbed this. "Gunwoo. I suspected him. I couldn't prove it. Still can't, not in a way that holds up to the kind of proof that matters." His jaw tightened. "The promise I made to Sua was that I would keep Minseo safe, that no one would be able to reach my son through her. I failed that promise in the most complete way possible. You didn't know. I should have known." Daejin. She used his name the way he'd used hers this morning. Direct, certain, cutting through. He looked at her. "Grief and guilt sound different. What I just heard was guilt. And guilt is not the same as failure." He looked at her for a long moment. The garden light was low and warm, and it caught the angles of his face in a way that showed the exhaustion underneath the control, the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying something alone and in silence for years and years. "You speak very plainly," he said. "It saves time," she said. "Most people are afraid to." "I'm not most people." He looked at her that same direct look and said nothing for a few seconds. And in those seconds, the distance she had left between them on the bench was still exactly the same distance, but felt like a different measurement entirely. "No," he said finally. "You are not." She looked back at the hedges. "What traitor?" Mincio said. "Someone close betrayed the family." The file. Someone inside the security circle passed information to Gunwoo about Sua's schedule, her route, the night she died. His voice went flat. "I've been narrowing it down for 3 years. I'm close. But close is not the same as certain, and I won't move on someone inside my house until I'm certain." Nia thought about the room with the zip-tied men, about what certain looked like when Daejin found it. "Is it someone who's still here?" she asked. "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. "Then tonight, when Gunwoo called and said Daejin has left his house, he was telling me he still has someone inside," Daejin said. "Yes." Their eyes met. Neither of them said what that meant for Nia being in the house. For Mincio, for Loretta sleeping 3 floors up, it didn't need to be said. It was already fully formed and present between them like a third person on the bench. Daejin's phone lit up. He looked at it. He stood up. "What?" she said. He was already moving toward the door, jacket back on. The human thing that had been on his face in the garden, folding back into the operational face so fast, it was like watching a door close. "One of my security leads didn't check in at his scheduled time," he said. "What does that mean?" He paused at the door and looked back at her. "It means the traitor just made a decision tonight," he said. "And tomorrow, I'll know exactly who it is." He went inside. Nia sat in the garden alone with the sound of the low wind and the weight of everything she had just been told. And she thought, someone in this house helped Gunwoo take her grandmother. Someone in this house was inside the walls right now. And then her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. A photograph. The photograph was of the study, the open drawer, the corner of Sua's photo sticking out. It had been taken less than 3 hours ago. From inside the room, while Nia was standing right there. The traitor has been inside the house this entire time, and they now know that Nia found the file. Before you move to the next chapter, think about who had access to that room tonight. The answer has been in front of you. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next. Stories that will move you, shake you, and remind you what courage actually looks like. Chapter 8. The first explosion hit the east wing at 2:17 in the morning. The sound was enormous, not a bang, but a compression, like the air itself had been punched inward, and every window in the east corridor shattered outward simultaneously in a single crystalline burst. The alarm system triggered 3 seconds later, which meant 3 seconds where the only sound in the mansion was breaking glass and the specific high cry of a child. Minseo. Nia was off the guest room bed before she was fully awake, feet hitting cold stone, moving toward the sound on instinct alone. The corridor was already filling with smoke from the east wing, not thick yet, but the smell was immediate and specific, chemical and hot and wrong. 2 guards ran past her toward the east wing. One ran back the other direction, away from the fire. She registered that, filed it, kept moving. Minsio's room was in the north corridor, across the main landing. She made it to his door and shoved it open, and he was upright in his bed, both hands gripping the mattress edge, face tight with a fear he was actively fighting to manage. "I've got you," she said. She crossed the room, grabbed the wheelchair from beside the bed, opened it in one motion. "Can you transfer yourself?" Yes. He was already moving. He had done this 1,000 times in therapy, and the muscle memory held even now, even with the alarm screaming and smoke beginning to edge under the door. He moved from bed to chair with a focus that steadied her own breathing. "Good," she said. "Let's go." She pushed the chair into the corridor. The main landing was chaos. Staff were moving in multiple directions. 2 bodyguards were shouting into earpieces. The lights in the east wing had gone entirely. which meant the second explosion had taken a power junction, and the emergency lighting cast everything in a flat orange that made the smoke look worse than it was, or maybe it was exactly as bad as it looked. She scanned for Daejin and couldn't find him. A guard she recognized not Jung, another one, younger, came toward her from the south stairwell. "This way," he said. "Mr. Kwon said to use the south exit." "Where is he?" "East wing." Her chest clenched. "The fire is in the east wing." "He went after the shooter, ma'am. Please, this way." She looked at Minseo. He looked back at her. His face said the same thing hers did. "Go," she said to the guard. "Take him to the south exit. Don't stop. Don't wait for me." "Miss Calder." "That is not a discussion." She locked eyes with Minseo. "Go with him. I will be right behind you. I promise." Minseo's jaw set. "You better be," he said, and the guard began moving the chair toward the south stairwell. Nia turned and ran toward the east wing. The fire was in the library, or had been. The room was largely gone now, the ceiling partially collapsed. One wall open to the outside where the first explosion had blown through it. Heat came off the wreckage in rolling waves. A section of the corridor beyond the library was still burning. She almost didn't see them. Daejin had Gunwoo against the far corridor wall, or had him, because Gunwoo had gotten loose enough to land something across Daejin's ribs that made him stagger, and now both men were moving in the tight, ugly, practical way of people who are actually trying to damage each other rather than make a point. A third man was on the floor already, not moving. Gunwoo reached for something at his belt. Nia grabbed the first solid object within reach, a decorative iron stand that had somehow survived the blast, 2 feet away along the wall, and she crossed the space in 4 steps and drove the base of it into Gunwoo's forearm with everything she had. The object at his belt hit the floor. Gunwoo's eyes found her with an expression she would see in her sleep for months afterward. Not pain, not surprise, but a cold, focused recalculation, like a chess player watching a piece move that changes the shape of the board. Daejin moved. It was fast and final, and she looked away. When she looked back, Gunwoo was on the floor, conscious, and Daejin was standing over him, breathing hard, and the corridor was filling with security from both directions. Daejin turned. He took in the iron stand in her hands. He took in the fact that she was standing in a burning corridor on the east wing that she had been told explicitly to leave. His expression cycled through several things very quickly. "You were supposed to be at the south exit," he said. "You were supposed to not be in a burning building alone," she said. "I had backup coming. It was taking a while." He stared at her. Something broke loose on his face, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and the release of it changed the quality of the air between them, the same way pressure changes before weather. He crossed the distance between them. He put one hand along the side of her face, and the warmth of his palm against her smoke-cold skin was so immediate and specific that she felt it from her jaw to the base of her throat. He looked at her for 1 second, just looked full and direct, and without any of the careful management he applied to everything else. Then he kissed her, not tentatively, not as a question, the way a man kisses someone when the decision was made a long time ago and the world just finally ran out of reasons to wait. His other hand came to her waist, and she felt the solid certainty of it, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart going fast, real, not controlled at all, and kissed him back. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then blue and red light flooded through the blown-out wall. Outside, across the grounds, a line of police vehicles was moving through the front gate. Sirens, lights, radios, the full weight of official consequence arriving all at once. Daejin stepped back. He looked at her face. Then he looked at the police lights sweeping the grounds through the smoke, and his expression completed its return to something operational and measured and braced. "Stay close to Minseo," he said. "Daejin, stay close to him." He held her eyes for 1 more second, and in that second she saw the full cost of everything, the years, the loss, the violence, and underneath all of it, something intact and fierce that 3 years of grief hadn't reached. Then he turned and walked toward the police lights. She stood in the ruined corridor with smoke above her and heat at her back, and her hand still raised where it had been against his chest. Then she turned and ran for the south exit. She made it to the grounds to find Mincio where she had promised at the south exit, blanket around his shoulders, Jung beside him, face turned toward the chaos in the east wing. When he saw her come through the door, he let out a breath so sharp it was almost a sound. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. She crouched down beside his chair and put her arm around his shoulders, and he leaned into her, and they both watched the police move through the grounds and the smoke rise from the east wing into a sky that was just beginning to think about morning. After a long moment, Mincio said, "Dad's going to be arrested, isn't he?" She didn't answer, which was, of course, an answer. Mincio pulled the blanket tighter. "He won't let them keep him," he said, with a certainty she didn't know whether to believe or protect him from. "He never does." Across the grounds, she could see Daejin standing between two officers with his hands in his coat pockets, talking in a measured tone. Not cuffed, not detained, not yet. But the officers were not going anywhere, and there were a lot of them. And the east wing of the mansion was still burning, and Gunwoo had been loaded into a separate vehicle that she could see but couldn't read. Her phone buzzed. Jung, standing 2 feet away, looked at his own phone at the same moment. They looked at each other. "The security lead they found," Jung said carefully. "The one who missed his check-in last night." "The traitor," Nia said. "He confessed an hour ago. To the police, not to us." Jung's voice was flat and careful. He gave them 3 years of financial records, wire transfers from Gunwoo, a pause, and call logs, including calls placed to an officer inside the department. Nia went very still. It means some of what's happening over there right now," Jung said, nodding toward Daejin and the officers, "may not be as straightforward as it looks." She looked at Daejin across the grounds. He glanced back at her over the officer's shoulder. 1 second. Then the officer stepped between them, and the eye contact broke. The traitor's confession was supposed to help. But what if some of those call logs lead somewhere that makes tonight worse instead of better? Keep watching, and subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. Every week we bring you stories of sacrifice, love, and courage that will leave you thinking for days. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Chapter 9. Daejin was not arrested. He was questioned for 4 hours in the back of a police vehicle parked at the edge of the grounds while the east wing smoldered and investigators moved through the wreckage with flashlights. When he came out, just before sunrise, he was not cuffed and he was not charged, and the officer who had been most aggressive with the questioning was visibly less aggressive by the end than he had been at the beginning. Money, influence, lawyers on the phone. By 2:45 in the morning, Nia didn't ask which combination had produced the outcome. She was sitting on the south steps, with Mincio asleep against her shoulder, his weight heavy and trusting in the specific way only sleeping children achieve. She felt Daejin before she heard him, that change in pressure, that gravitational quality his presence had. He sat down on the step below hers, close enough that she was aware of his shoulder near her knee. He looked at his son asleep on her shoulder for a long moment. Then, he put his elbows on his knees and looked at the ground and said nothing. She let him have the silence. After a while, he said, "It was Park, my head of interior security, 16 years. 16 years meant he was there before Sua's death, before Mincio's surgeries, before everything." "I know," Nia said quietly. "I should have—" He stopped. "You didn't know," she said. The same words she'd used in the garden, and they landed the same way, pushing back against the guilt with something factual and clean. 3 years, he said. 3 years he was in this house. He's not in it now. Daejin looked up at the sky. The smoke from the east wing had thinned. The first pale gray of early morning was starting at the edge of the lake horizon. Gunwoo's lawyers will have him out within 48 hours, he said. The physical evidence ties him to the mansion attack. It doesn't touch Sua. It never will. His jaw worked. "I can still end this. Daejin." He turned his head. "Minseo told me today that if you leave, you won't come back." She said it simply, without armor around it. Not because he thinks you'll die. Because he knows what finishing this would require you to become. And he knows that version of you doesn't come home. The grounds were quiet. Investigators were packing up near the east wing. Jung stood 30 feet away, giving them the appropriate space. Daejin looked at his sleeping son. Minseo's hand, even in sleep, was loosely wrapped around the edge of Nia's sleeve. He said that to you, Daejin said. In his way, yes. Daejin was still for a long time. Long enough that a bird started somewhere in the hedges beyond the south wall. That flat, unremarkable note that birds make in the first minutes before sunrise when the world hasn't decided what kind of day it's going to be yet. I have spent 12 years, he said slowly, making sure that nothing could reach me, that no one had access to anything I couldn't afford to lose. He paused. It didn't work. No, she agreed, because I miscalculated what could reach me. She waited. He turned and looked at her fully, directly, the way he'd looked at her in the burning corridor before he closed the distance. I am not good at this, he said. It cost him something to say it, and she could see the cost clearly. I know, she said. I don't know how to. He stopped. Tried again. The last 3 years, I have been a wall. I know how to be a wall. I don't know how to be human, she offered. I was going to say present, he said. Those are the same word. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something settled in his face, not resolution exactly, but the look of a decision being made one layer deeper than the visible ones. If I let this go, he said carefully, Gunwoo walks free. He will always be a threat. If you don't let this go, Minseo grows up watching his father become something he's afraid of. She held his gaze. Which threat scares you more? The bird in the hedge kept going. Minseo shifted against her shoulder in his sleep, making a small sound, and Daejin watched his son's face in the gray morning light with an expression that was completely unguarded, open, and aching, and full of the specific love that parents carry for children they have failed and are trying to stop. Failing. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay. I went to Gunwoo tonight because Park's confession included a piece of evidence I've been trying to find for 3 years. Proof of what he did to Sua. Not enough for a court. Enough for me. Nia held very still. When I had him in that corridor, Daejin said, I had the choice. I know. And you walked in before I made it. She looked at him. Is that a complaint? The corner of his mouth moved that reluctant, almost smile. No, he said quietly. It is not a complaint. They sat in the early morning on the south steps with his sleeping son between them and the ruined east wing behind them and the lake invisible but present beyond the tree line, and the decision Daejin had just made, not yet spoken fully, but made settled around them both like a change in weather. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, I call my lawyer and begin the conversation I should have had 2 years ago, about the businesses, about what gets dismantled and what gets restructured. He exhaled slowly. It will take time. It will cost more than money, and Gunwoo will remain a threat for some portion of that time. And Minseo? He looked at his son. Minseo needs a home. Not a fortress. A home. Nia nodded slowly. Then, from inside the mansion, from somewhere in the undamaged north wing, a sound came that stopped both of them completely. Her grandmother's voice. Loretta. Somewhere inside. Talking to someone in that particular carrying tone she used when she was being charming and immovable simultaneously. And responding to her, in careful, earnest, slightly formal English. Jung. Daejin and Nia stared at each other. Is your grandmother? He started. She grew up in Mississippi, Nia said. She will reorganize every person in that building within 72 hours. He looked at the door where the sound was coming from. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short, surprised, completely undefended, and it changed his face entirely. And Nia looked at that face and felt something settle into place in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was closed. Minseo stirred against her shoulder, opened his eyes, looked at his father. At the look on his father's face, the boy's own expression shifted into something wondering and cautious and deeply hopeful all at once. Are you okay? Minseo asked him. Daejin looked at his son for a moment, and then at Nia, and then back at Minseo. I'm working on it, he said. Minseo considered this with his usual seriousness. Then he nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes again. Daejin reached out and put his hand over Nia's, where it rested on Minseo's blanket. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. The bird in the hedge kept going, and the sky kept getting lighter, and his hand stayed where it was, warm and certain, and entirely without calculation. But across the grounds, through the gap in the tree line where the gate was visible in the early morning light, a black car was parked on the street outside. It had been there since before the police arrived. It was still there now. And the man inside it, not Gunwoo, not anyone Nia or Daejin had seen before, was watching the south steps through a long lens with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who is not here to act tonight, only to watch, only to learn. Gunwoo is contained, but he is not the only one who has been watching Daejin's weakness. The final chapter is here, and nothing about it will go the way you expect. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Stories built to move you, stay with you, and remind you that the most powerful thing in the world is still a person who refuses to stop caring. Chapter 10. 8 months passed, the way real change passes slowly in the day, fast in the rear view. The East Wing was rebuilt. The architecture was different this time, more light, more open, less fortress, and more house. Daejin had approved the designs himself, which the contractor had found unusual, because the previous owner had clearly not prioritized natural light. The contractor kept this observation to himself. The businesses were different too. Not Kwon Daejin was a man who understood that things built over decades are not unmade in a weekend, and he was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. But 3 of the outer operations were dissolved, 2 were restructured under legitimate management, and the particular category of work that had put men in rooms with zip-tied hands was no longer in operation. The lawyers who handled this process were expensive and discreet, and not entirely sure what they were handling, which was intentional. Gunwoo had been released 47 hours after his arrest, exactly as expected. His lawyers were better than anticipated, and the physical evidence from the mansion attack covered the attack and nothing else. He was out, public, and returned to his social rounds within a week, which was the most dangerous version of him, visible and temporarily careful. Daejin had not gone after him. Not once. Nia had asked him about it in the 2nd month, directly, the way she asked everything. He had been quiet for a moment and then said, "A man who is watching me become human is a man I can manage. A man who is watching me become a ghost is a man who has won." She had not had a response to that. It was, she thought, the most Daejin sentence he had ever said. Gunwoo was being watched by people with the right credentials and the right kind of patience. What happened next with him would happen in a courtroom, or not at all. Daejin had decided to believe that. He was not sure he believed it fully yet, but he was practicing. The Calder Kwon Foundation opened on a Friday morning in October, under a sky that was clear and cold and specifically beautiful in the way Chicago can be in fall when it decides to cooperate. Nia had started it with the structural help of 2 attorneys and the financial backing of a man who signed the paperwork without ceremony and told her only that she should build it the way she would want it built and not worry about budget. The foundation served disabled youth and violence survivors across the South and West Sides, physical rehabilitation programs, therapy access, education support, caregiver resources. The kind of programs that had not existed for Malik, the kind that had not existed for Minseo in his earliest years. She named it after her brother, the Nia Calder Foundation. Daejin had not commented on the name when she told him. He had just looked at her for a moment and then said, "He would have liked you." She hadn't asked how he knew. She understood that he had read the file on Malik the same way she had read the file on Sua, not to possess something, but to understand. The opening ceremony was small. Nia had insisted on small. Local press, community members, families from the first program cohort, and a group of children currently enrolled in the Foundation's first physical rehabilitation track, who were, at this moment, occupying the courtyard outside the Foundation building with a volume that suggested the ceremony was less interesting to them than the fact that there were cookies. Loretta was in the front row. She had moved into the mansion's East Guest Wing 6 months ago, which had been Minseo's idea and which Nia had taken 3 weeks to stop feeling complicated about. Loretta herself had taken approximately 4 hours to make the decision, and approximately none to feel complicated about it. She had a proper medical setup, a garden view, and Jung, who had been converted entirely into her personal driver and errand person by a process that nobody could fully explain, but everyone had accepted. Daejin was at the edge of the courtyard. He stood slightly apart from the main gathering, the way he usually did in public, not unfriendly, just occupying space with a particular quality of stillness that meant most people didn't approach unless approached first. He was watching the ceremony. He was watching Nia at the small podium near the entrance, talking without notes in the clear, direct way she talked. And cameras were going and people were listening, and she had no idea how she looked standing up there, which was exactly why she looked the way she did. Minseo was beside him. Not in the wheelchair. He was standing. He had support braces on both legs, custom-fitted, lightweight, the result of 8 months of twice-weekly physical therapy sessions that had started going differently after a certain point, around the time Minseo had decided, apparently on his own, that he wanted to try harder. The therapists attributed it to maturity and a developing sense of self-motivation. Nia had a different theory. She kept it to herself. He was standing beside his father with his hand loosely wrapped around Daejin's forearm for balance, watching Nia at the podium, and his face had the open quality it now wore regularly, not always, not without effort, but regularly, which was the honest version of progress. Nia finished speaking. Applause. The children in the courtyard contributed enthusiastically, mostly because they had been told to, and the cookies were contingent. Nia came down from the podium. She found Daejin and Minseo at the edge of the crowd and crossed to them, and when she reached them, Minseo let go of his father's arm and transferred his grip to her hand instead. Easy and natural and total, the way he'd held on since that first night on the dock. "You were good," he told her. "I was nervous," she said. "You didn't look it. That's what nervous looks like when you decide it isn't allowed to show." He considered this. "I'm going to use that. I know you are." She looked up at Daejin. He was looking at her with that expression that no longer surprised her, the one that had no public version, the one that lived only in specific rooms and specific moments, and that she had stopped trying to catalog and started simply accepting as the truest thing about him. "Well," she said. "The cookies are running out," he said. "Daejin, you did well. Simply, directly. Malik would be proud." Her throat closed for exactly 1 second. She held it. Then she nodded, and he reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back behind her ear, unhurried, matter-of-fact, in full view of every camera and every person in the courtyard. And the gesture was so uncalculated and so entirely unlike the version of him the world had been given for 12 years that the photographer from the local paper caught it without meaning to, and would later call it the photo of the month. Minseo noticed. He looked up at both of them. Then he looked at their joined hands, Nia's and his. Daejin's at her hair, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a child who has watched a situation develop over 8 months and has known for at least 7 of them exactly where it was going and has been patient about it in the way that children are patient when they understand something adults are still pretending to figure out. Finally, he said. Daejin looked down at his son. "Mind your business," he said. "This is my business," Minseo said simply. Nia laughed. The sound of it moved through the courtyard and people nearby smiled without knowing why, the way warmth moves through a room when something genuinely good is happening in it. The October sky was sharp and clear above the building. The children were eating cookies. Loretta was talking with 2 foundation parents in the front row, with the focused intent of a woman who had already decided to reorganize this organization's volunteer schedule. And Daejin stood in the middle of a courtyard full of people who knew his name but not his face, not the real one, with his son standing upright beside him and this woman whose hand he had not decided to let go of, and he let himself stay inside the moment without calculating what it cost. He was still working on that. He was getting better at it. Then his phone buzzed. He took it out of habit, glanced at the screen. A message from a number his system flagged as unknown, blocked, scrubbed, bounced, through 3 servers, the kind of number used by people who did not want to be located. 3 words. No signature. Congratulations on today. He read it twice. His face did not change. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked across the courtyard at the street beyond the low fence at the edge of the property, at the morning traffic moving past, at the ordinary faces of ordinary people going about their Friday. He didn't see anything, which, in his experience, meant nothing, because the most dangerous people were never the ones you could see. Minseo tugged his sleeve. Dad. He looked down. Are you okay? Minseo asked. Daejin looked at his son's face steady, watching, carrying the specific courage of a child who has learned to ask the hard question out loud. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Yes, he said. And then, because it was true and because practicing meant saying the true things, right now, in this moment, yes. Minseo held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to watch Nia move through the crowd, talking and laughing, carrying the particular brightness of a person who has found the exact thing they were built to do. The street beyond the fence was ordinary and busy and full of Friday morning Chicago. Daejin watched it for exactly 5 more seconds. Then he let it go. He turned back to his family. And he stayed. This story is done, but the world doesn't stop when the credits roll, does it? If this chapter moved something in you, put it in the comments below. Tell us the moment that hit hardest. Was it Minseo standing up? Loretta in the front row? Or the 3 words on that phone that reminded us that love and danger never fully separate? Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. Every week, we bring you a new story built at the intersection of love, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. Share this story with one person tonight. Not because we asked you to, because some stories deserve to travel further than the screen they started on.